With so many casualties, the 5th Company's clerics could only cast enough lesser restoration spells to remove the effects of the gnolls' envenomed arrows. The rest of their mana was conserved for their march back to the camp. Healing potions were only used for the most grievous of injuries for the same reason. Between the Allrunner and the Gnoll ambush, the 2 companies had suffered over 3 dozen losses. The 13th Company had lost its captain and all of its clerics and mages, decisively rendering it non-operational. Its survivors were devastated at the loss and weary from being held in thrall by their heteromorphic captor. The trek back to the camp felt 4 times longer than it did on the way in. Though the ranger squads were screening against potential assaults, Rangobart still jumped at every animal call, rustling fern and broken twig along the way. During their advance, he had identified the lack of a shared visceral experience with the rest of the company as something that created a wall between the mages and everyone else. Now, he was no longer so envious of them. Mages were nowhere near as durable as Imperial Knights, Rangers or Clerics. Even rogues were tougher. In hindsight, any of the nostalgic recollections that they shared around campfires would have probably been the end of him. Night had fallen by the time they limped back to the 1st Division's forward camp. There had been no attacks along the way, but Rangobart was still a bundle of raw nerves by the time he crossed the line of defensive barricades. As men from the camp helped the battered men in, he cast a clean spell and forced himself to trudge over to the command pavilion. Commander Enz awaited them with a grim expression. "Good work bringing them back," the commander said. "Not all of us made it back, sir," Captain German sighed. "That plant thing I can understand, but did no one pick up these gnolls?" "They've been entirely disorganized before now," Commander Enz told him. "Fleeing as we moved in. Today's the first we've seen them going on the offensive." "Today?" The captain frowned. "You mean this is happening elsewhere?" "All across the front. What happened with you was particularly bad, but the Legion still lost around 300 men since this afternoon." Rangobart gaped wordlessly at the news. In less than half a day, the 2nd Legion had lost 3% of its forces. "How many are we up against?" Captain German asked. "We have no idea," the commander replied. "We can't even see them most of the time. These aren't the random, mixed tribals that we've been sweeping up for the past few days. Someone's organized their warriors and now they're taking the fight to us. What little information that we do have says that they're operating in squad-sized groups. A company gets hit by a few volleys of arrows and the Demis are gone before anyone can retaliate." "What about the Death Series servitors? These gnolls shouldn't be remotely a match for them." "We don't get to choose the fights," Commander Renz told him. "Our attackers do. Most of the strikes have been aimed at companies without the undead. Lose a few men here and there over time and it adds up. General Carbine and his staff are working on a plan right now. Hopefully, we'll have something workable by tomorrow morning." Rangobart wasn't even aware of the gnolls until their arrows started falling around them. In the second it took for him to realize that they were under attack, an arrow had already found his throat. Given that the gnolls would have been pacified by the Allrunner if they had gotten too close, it had come from well beyond his spell range. How could they fight opponents that they couldn't see or reach? The debriefing continued, with Commander Enz going over their observations and any concerns to be communicated to General Carbine. Companies coming in after them added their feedback and a lengthy discussion between the commander and his captains ensued. As with nearly everyone else, their casualties were light but, as a whole, the 1st Division had been significantly weakened. Roughly 80 men had been lost. 200 more were waiting for healing. 14% of the 1st Division was effectively out of the action and slow mana regeneration rates had become a bottleneck for recovery. The highly aggressive posture that was characteristic of their advance up until that point flipped into a defensive one as they digested the unsustainable attrition that they found themselves facing. The Imperial Army had come in swinging and a single jab had stopped them cold. As the evening wore on, Commander Enz left to meet with General Carbine by Hippogriff. He left the captains to improve on the camp's defenses and settle in for a potentially harrowing night. "Our current barricades aren't going to work," one of the captains said. "Any sort of harassment and we're going to see these things going into our tents." He pointed at one of the gnoll arrows laid out over the table. Including its obsidian head, it was roughly a meter long and as thick as Rangobart's thumb. It may as well have been a ballista bolt. "We could raise some walls." "That's too ambitious. We can't raise walls to protect a whole division overnight." "Sections, Then, one for each company facing outwards. We already have a perimeter of platforms built around the trunks of the largest trees so we can extend the walls from those. It did seem a comfort. He wouldn't be able to rest knowing that an arrow might come flying out of the night to kill him in his tent. The sooner we get something up, Captain Oryx said, the better. It doesn't have to be perfect, just enough to stop these arrows. Logs and big branches propped up by earthworks. Wattle panels for the tents. We have a whole mess of materials from the area we cleared out around the camp. If we set patrols 300 meters or so out, only the outside edges of the camp will be within their bow range. Can we send patrols that far out? The captain of the 10th company asked. A lot of these gnolls probably outclass our rangers. We'll just end up with squads of dead rangers. We can set them up with the undead, Captain Germond offered. Gnolls won't fight in the open unless they have an overwhelming advantage or they're forced to. Splitting up the undead and having them go around regularly with rangers to spot for them should be deterrent enough. We can have the rangers and rogues lay traps on approaches we don't want these demos taking. A loose plan came together and the captains dispersed to organize their companies. Rangobart and Lady Zaradnik joined Captain Germond as they headed out to the 5th Company's area on the west side of the camp. The soldiers seemed to shake themselves free of their weary nervousness when they were given tasks to focus on. They went over to the officer's pavilion with portions of dinner grown cold over the evening. He scooped out a spoonful of what appeared to be a half-solidified stew with chunks of vegetables and meat in it. Famished as he was, it tasted exquisite all the same. You didn't have much to say there, my lady, Captain Germond said. It's a challenging issue on such short notice, the Baroness said. I tend to focus on problems and it probably becomes too much for people to handle if they're not used to it. My input would probably agitate an already stressful situation. I don't think anyone would resent you for pointing out critical issues. Better than losing men. I think the captains came up with suitable solutions, Lady Zaradnik replied. So far, it appears that only the gnolls are organizing resistance while the other races are still as vulnerable as before. Even so, their skirmishing has managed to stop the Imperial Army in its tracks. I don't recall a single captain at that meeting reporting a raid against a gnoll settlement, so it appears that they've all uprooted themselves. Even with so much power at your disposal, the Imperial Army can't catch them effectively and there is no stationary target to hit. Captain Germond nodded as he worked on a mouthful of stew. The first day or two of their advance had been deceptively easy when it came to fighting the isolated tribes they encountered. Now, however, a single race with superior stealth, movement and powerful ranged attacks had paralyzed them with what would be considered light harassment on paper. Furthermore, Lady Zaradnik said, our objective is to deprive the Viridian Dragon Lord of as much of her support as possible and every day these gnolls hold the army back is one more day she has to recover from her injuries. She will reappear, eventually. Since you put it that way, the captain said, shouldn't we be withdrawing? If we're stuck here, we can't make any gains towards our objective. We only stand to lose when the Dragon Lord finally comes out. Lady Zaradnik finished her bowl and placed it on the table. She watched a group of men nearby as they wove branches together into protective panels for their tents. It is General Carbane's decision to make. Also, we don't know what they'll come up with for tomorrow. He and his staff are far more experienced than I am when it comes to commanding armies. If it was up to you, my lady, Rangobart asked, what would you do? That would depend on where I could hypothetically start from. What do you mean? The Baroness turned her gaze back to them, taking her cup of water from the table as she looked down at the map spread out over it. The leadership of the Empire has known about this task for several months, she said. If I was free to do as I wished from that point, I would have prepared provisions for the demi-humans in the blister and convinced them to leave temporarily while we dealt with the dragon. Once the task was complete, they could move back in. Several seconds passed in silence between them. That's it? Captain Germond frowned. That's it. The objective of the missive is to end the contract between the cities of the Blister and the Viridian Dragon Lord. We lack the means to peaceably convince her to abandon her superior position. The tribes under the Dragon Lord's influence are what keep us from decisively accomplishing our task by force. You speak as if these demi-humans would so readily heed us. They would just as soon eat us. The world had certain rules that are universally understood, Lady Zaradnik said. Rules that the Empire chooses to exploit when convenient and violate when not. Goblins are the easiest to negotiate with. Ogres are also simple to handle. Out of the demi-human races we've encountered so far, trolls would probably be the hardest to convince. At the same time, they are relatively uncommon and I haven't seen a troll mystic here, so just ignoring them would probably not be an issue. We haven't seen any troglodytes yet, so I'll reserve judgment for them until we do. Captain German leaned back on his stool, crossing his arms with a doubtful look. Alright, assuming that this somehow happens, how in the world do you plan on provisioning the tribes of the Blister? The Empire dissolved 2 legions recently. Agricultural produce in the Sorceress Kingdom is quite cheap. A portion of the surplus defense budget could have been allocated to secure provisions. What you save in tribute adds to that, and this course of action paves the way for future opportunities. Such as trade, perhaps? I wouldn't have known that the tribes had piles of gems and precious ores lying around, but I would at least assume that the unique environment of the Blister produces resources unobtainable anywhere else in the region. By making connections with the tribes within, the Empire would gain access to a previously untapped market. This line of reasoning assumes a whole string of things working out in your favor. Not exactly, Lady Zaradnik replied. It assumes that a mutually beneficial arrangement can be achieved between the Empire and the tribes of the Blister. This may sound strange coming from me, but the Empire has a very one-sided stance when it comes to expansion and development. You're right, the captain furrowed his brow. It does sound strange coming from you. I hadn't realized it until now, but you're a follower of the Six, aren't you? The theocracy accent, your southern lineage, the trim on your armor, the measured way by which you always conduct yourself. You're an adherent of Sir Sana. Rangobart blinked at the revelation of something that should have been blatantly obvious. His confusion rose when he considered that a worshipper of the god of death in a human religion well known for its hostility towards other races was proposing peaceful coexistence with them. It's a common misconception, Lady Zaradnik smiled slightly. For the past 6 centuries, the faith of the Six has worked to facilitate the survival, well-being and development of humanity. The slain theocracy's national policy of mitigating potential threats to humans represents but a single avenue by which this objective might be pursued. In the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the agendas of our faith are best served through working to create a better nation for all. Thus, it is unnecessary to harbor such belligerent attitudes against other species. If the temples of the Four could be so accommodating, Captain German said, half of the Empire's problems would vanish and we'd have 3 times as many clerics in the army. The captain's claim felt exaggerated, or was it? When it came to their influence over the citizens, it was tacitly understood that the imperial administration considered the temples as a sort of untouchable rival with problematic policies. If they became something like a government department, or at least cooperated with the emperor, many obstacles to progress would disappear. Being what I am, Lady Zaradnik said, I'm wary of making any religious commentary here. From an administrative perspective, however, the cultural and religious influence of the temples can be a thorny issue to deal with in a secular state. But rather than the faithful themselves, it is the fact that some policies of the temples of the Four are irreconcilable with those of the imperial administration, and the Sorcerer's Kingdom, for that matter. Like the undead being the enemies of the living. It is an irresponsibly simplistic stance to take, the Baroness tapped a finger against her cup. But I believe that it stems from the fact that the undead most are commonly exposed to are mindless beings naturally manifested from negative energy. There was a course that provided a loose overview of necromantic concepts in the Imperial Magic Academy, but it wasn't a very popular one to take. It was, however, mandatory for students of the magic stream as a form of familiarization with necromancy school magic. Contrary to popular belief, many necromancy spells did not have anything to do with animating undead. As a war wizard, spells like Scare, Ray of Enfeeblement, Blindness/Deafness, Word of Curse and Ghoul Touch were indispensable for policing duties. Others, like Mind of Undeath, were highly useful defensive spells. Then there were spells like Command Undead and Disrupt Undead which were useful when fighting against undead opponents. As with many of the Academy's courses, however, it primarily dealt with practical applications of necromancy rather than esoteric topics like the study of negative energy. To their defense, Rangobart didn't think that anyone understood how it worked beyond how it might manifest and what its presence entailed. Namely, the potential generation of undead beings and their impact on human society. I can understand broad perceptions being erroneously applied to created undead like the Death Series servitors we've leased, Rangobat said, but are you implying that naturally spawned undead are different? It is best framed as a difference in ecology, Lady Zaradnik said. Take the majority of humans in the Empire, for example. Pastoral environments are considered idyllic. Forests, jungles and mountains are considered hostile, as are the creatures that dwell within them. Most think nothing of it. Environments conducive to human growth are naturally perceived as good while others are bad. So, we see the Katsa Plains as a wasteland, but the undead see it as a paradise? Lady Zaradnik emptied her cup and put it away. She leaned forward, folding her arms on the table. Not exactly. It is not the physical appearance of the Katsa Plains that naturally manifested undead beings consider ideal. An elder lich who dwells there will still try to improve their lot in life. They wouldn't be satisfied with the leveled remnants of villages, towns and cities any more than humans would be happy with a burned-out farmstead. The principal difference is that they are products of the negative energy ecology that I mentioned. Mindless undead react with hostility to elements from an opposed ecology characterized by life or positive energy. In this regard, your temples are correct. The vast majority of undead are predisposed to hostile behavior against the living. However, just as humans can coexist with people that they hate or even those that might eat them in a different situation, intelligent undead can coexist with the living so long as a framework through which they can achieve their personal goals exists. Some undead even prefer having the living around, and their behavior is not solely dictated by the fact that they are beings animated by negative energy. If Lady Zaradnik's explanation was accurate, the tales of undead beings such as elder liches ruling cities and interacting with the living were less fanciful than most believed. The sorcerer king establishing a nation also felt less suspicious and more pragmatic. Still, Rangobat felt that a human trying to get along with any non-summoned undead would be akin to a brick of charcoal trying to get along with a fire elemental. Can the undead form relationships as humans do? He asked, beyond those that are formed in pursuit of personal interests? Trying to define other species by squeezing them into the mold of human behaviors is a fallacy on its own, Lady Zaradnik told him, but as far as you might understand, yes. I maintain amicable relations with many species, living or undead. As may any race with any other race in the Sorceress Kingdom. The key lies not in misguided attempts to hold everyone to the standards of a single race, but in respecting our differences and what they entail. We embrace the connections and overarching culture that is formed out of the contributions made by each race. In that case, Captain German said, I can't imagine that you approve of what we're doing right now. Not long ago, I probably would have welcomed it. Now, both on a personal level and as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom, I do not. But it is not my place to dictate imperial policy. I am a liaison officer between our two nations and I will fulfill my duties as one. Then what would you do in our present situation? Assuming that it is too late to change our course, achieve as many objectives as possible in the most efficient ways that I can think of. After that, I would withdraw to prepare for the confrontation with the Viridian Dragon Lord, but the world is usually not so convenient. So about that thing yesterday. Rangobat didn't look up from his work as Harlow came over to the officers' pavilion. With defensive preparations made a priority the previous evening, there had been no time to see to the company's administrative tasks. His pen scratched endlessly over crisp sheets of paper, toiling to catch up with their paperwork. Does that count as two beautiful women fighting over me? His pen stopped. He turned his head up to level a flat stare at Harlow. You've been deployed for less than 3 weeks, Harlow. One of those beautiful women was a plant. Lady Zaradnik came up and slapped me first, Harlow added. Think that means anything? She slapped Captain German first. I don't mind being second. He couldn't understand how Harlow could be so cavalier. Technically, he was a cavalier, but Rangobat didn't think that it had anything to do with his outlook. The man shrugged off null arrows, dragons and hungry plant women like spring rain. Did anything happen to your men overnight? Rangobat asked. Nope, Harlow answered. We all slept like logs. No holes in our tents when morning came. Ugh, Rangobat grimaced. We spent all that time setting everything up. Hey, better to have something and not need it than the other way round. Rangobat supposed that he had the right of it. For some reason, however, commoners only seemed to apply that bit of wisdom to themselves. When nobles made purchases that they might need and ended up not using them, everyone else muttered darkly into their cups. As Harlow indicated, night had passed without incident. Even the perimeter patrols noticed no sign of potential attacks. The 1st Division rose in the morning uninjured and cranky from working the doubled night watch. Commander Enns returned from the general's headquarters and the captains were called in. Lady Zaradnik went with Captain Germond while Rangobart opted to stay behind and deal with the company's reports. There was no telling when the next chance to get it done would appear. A commotion rose from deeper in the camp. Captain Germond appeared with Lady Zaradnik several minutes later. Rangobart, Harlow and the others around the table looked towards them expectantly. "Looks like General Carbine had the same idea as Lady Zaradnik," the captain said. "It's going to be a combined offensive." Captain Germond called for the sergeants and, once they had gathered, he continued. "We'll be operating as divisions for this. The general is consolidating our offense into 2 main thrusts. On the right wing will be the 2nd Division. The left will be the 3rd. They'll be getting 2 divisions worth of undead each. One will be with the center. The 1st Division will form the center with General Carbine while the 4th and 5th cover our flanks." "What is it that we're going to be doing, exactly?" Sergeant Zint asked. "Sweeping what we can," Captain Germond answered. "Chasing these gnolls around is pointless. We're going to be moving through and hitting everything else. The air wing is already done picking apart the far fringes of the jungle, so all that's left is looping through the main area that hasn't been cleared yet. Wing Commander Burke will be switching to reconnaissance and air support, flying under the canopy and marking out the demi-human settlements along the way." "How many days is this going to take?" Sergeant Calloway's question came from across the table. 2, the captain replied. "After that, we're getting out of here. That dragon is bound to rear her ugly head at some point and the general doesn't want to be around when that happens." Rangobart slowly nodded, anticipation and relief competing with one another. They were only on their 4th day but he was already sick and tired of the jungle. The captain started going over the details of their deployment. With the shift from independently operating companies to working together as a division, battalions were formed out of each type of infantry. The captains and clerics were distributed evenly across the battalions while the majors were kept behind the heavy infantry with Commander Renz and his bodyguard. With the rest of the army group coming to them, they took the time to get extra rest and make additional preparations. General Carbine arrived that evening and the divisions were ready to go by the morning. Gazing out over the ranks stretching out beyond his vision, Rangobart couldn't help but feel a thrill rush through him. "You seem excited," Lady Zaradnik noted with a slight smile. "I am, my lady," Rangobart admitted. "It just looks so impressive, but I'm not sure if it's right to be excited or not." "You should be," Commander Enz's voice came from behind them. "You're a soldier of the Imperial Army, you have a right to be proud. At the same time, it's good that you're questioning yourself. Whenever something like this happens, men are bound to die. That sense of accountability you have does you credit, Reburbad. You'll make a fine officer one day." He wasn't sure what to say. 2 weeks ago, he would have seen the commander's words as empty praise. War wizards were officers, but only nominally. They were nothing like the commanders and captains who formed the core of the Imperial Army. With the experiences of the past week, however, Commander Enz's words took on a different meaning. Rangobart was a spare, but he was still a noble. Like the martial nobles who helped create the Imperial Army, he could help create a true place for its mages. It was an opportunity that very few possessed and, despite owing much of his current station to his family, it was an undertaking that he thought he could rightfully claim as his own. Attention. The ranks snapped to attention. "One of these days, you're going to get the both of us sniped, Enns." "Yes, sir." Rolling his eyes, General Carbine arrived with his bodyguard, the 1st Company of the 2nd Legion's 1st Division. The men took their place in the center of the 1st Division's formation. From the back of his hippogriff, the general quietly scanned the surroundings for several moments before pulling a silvery watch out of his pocket. "It's time to go. General, advance." The range of vanguard swept forward, followed by the steady march of formations behind. Wings of dragoons flew down through gaps in the canopy, weaving their way through the trees. Flashes of light occasionally lit the distant undergrowth ahead. "We're moving more smoothly than we have in the past few days," Lady Zaradnik noted. "This is the full might of the 2nd Legion," Commander Enns said. "Before, You had captains leading their companies on independent tactical operations. Now, you have captains leading their men under the influence of their commanders and the general. We're a whole different beast, now. Every man is that much better. You're using skills and abilities on the entire division? Yes, the commander nodded. And the general is applying his to the entire army. We won't exactly be flying through the air, but I think our opponents will be surprised at how rapidly we advance. And advance they did. The Rangers ousted smaller tribes and the larger ones that they bypassed were trampled by the main line. Goblins and trolls alike were crushed by the sheer weight of the Imperial battalions. Rangobot glanced over at Lady Zaradnik, who silently observed it all from behind her unreadable mask. How would she report this to her superiors? How would that report be received? The Sorceress Kingdom was supposedly a place where all races were encouraged to live in harmony with one another. While the Empire did not explicitly make the existence of other races illegal, it was a nation where human agendas dictated policy. That agenda was on display in full force now. Even as Rangobart was made aware of this, it didn't feel wrong. It was more that he was sensitive to the fact that Lady Zaradnik personally did not approve of their actions. Humans had been preyed upon by demi-humans, heteromorphs and monsters for longer than history could tell. There was nothing reprehensible about humans gaining the means to effectively defend themselves and fight back. A piercing shriek filled the air. Rangobart could only marvel at how he didn't miss a step at the sound. Dragon on our right flank, Commander Enns reported. Juvenile. It was hiding in the canopy, but Burke's flight knocked it down before it could do any damage. The Death Warrior on that side got to it. Rangobart fingered the potions in his belt pouch. It must have only been a few hundred meters away. He imagined the cloud of corrosive gas that would blanket them if one went unnoticed. As evening approached, spear tips enchanted with continual light spells were raised high to illuminate the way ahead. The 2nd Legion maneuvered to avoid the flooded expanse of the jungle and Rangobart raised a hand to wave away the insects attracted by their passing. How has the army fared against the poisonous plants, venomous creatures and disease? Lady Zaradnik asked. With months to prepare for this, General Carbane said, it stopped being an issue once we entered the jungle and authorized the use of consumables. Our stockpiles are sufficient for a month-long campaign in here, but it still hurts to think how much gold we go through every day mitigating the effects of this place. As far as disease goes, nothing's spreading, yet. The clerics are keeping a close eye on things and dealing with cases as they appear. Is it sustainable with the ratio of divine casters in the 2nd Legion? As long as we can stay on top of things, yes. I made doubly sure that the men understood not to overlook any new conditions that they picked up. Outbreaks due to a soldier thinking they could just brush off a cough or treat a rash as a mere inconvenience aren't entirely unknown. The general turned his head, engaging in some distant conversation. Lady Zaradnik's attention went to the flooded jungles down the slope. As dark as it was getting, Rangobart couldn't imagine that there was much to see. Aerial reconnaissance has located a likely place for us to camp, General Carbane said sometime later. About 2 hours to the northwest. It's high and dry, fortunately. Once the zombies catch up, we'll be sending them along with some Death Series servitors into the surrounding areas overnight. It should spare us any harassment while the men rest. Do you have any new questions or concerns about the undead forces? Lady Zaradnik asked. Problems you've encountered as well. This is a unique environment for the region. Your assistance during the planning phase was comprehensive enough that nothing has fallen outside of the realm of our expectations. The fact that we can use them to sweep waterlogged areas was a nice bonus. Green dragons can breathe underwater and we've found more than a few of them lurking out of sight like that. Rangobart's eyes were drawn ahead of them as a ranger with 2 uncomfortably familiar arrows in his gut was carried back by 2 others. A cleric rushed forward to tend to him while another spoke to one of the officers at the front. Well, that was inevitable, General Carbane muttered. The likely place to camp was also a defensible location for our opponents to fight from? Lady Zaradnik smirked. We thought so as well, the general nodded. I had the officers instruct the rangers to be extra cautious, but it seems that it wasn't enough against these gnolls. The injured ranger was helped back up to his feet. He brushed himself off and headed out with his fellows again. How should we approach this, sir? Commander Enns asked. If they're adamant on holding that hill, General Carbane answered, all the better for us. Stationary targets are ideal to deploy the undead against. Should we encircle them?
No. That will take hours to set up.
We'll be taking losses the entire time and it'll expose our rear. Maintain formation and push them right off with Death Knights. I'll get Burke in there as well. We can set up camp before it gets too late. General Carbane's orders went out and the 2 Death Knights with the 1st Division detached from the front line to advance up the 2-kilometer-long ridge. Sounds of battle rose in the distance, carrying the roars of the undead mixed with the yips, snarls and harsh baying of gnolls. The explosion of a fireball occasionally cast its orange glow over the advancing Imperial ranks. As the division brought up the rear, evidence of passage by the combatants marked the way. Crushed vegetation, displaced soil and the deep imprints of Death Knight steps could be seen everywhere. What was distinctly lacking, however, were any signs of injury or bloodshed.
It looks like they retreated again, Commander N said.
Damn, they're annoying. Lady Zaradnik, are there any undead forces available for lease that can deal with gnolls and similar opponents in this absurd terrain? With the undead forces currently leased to this region, the Baroness replied, I believe the 2nd Legion already has everything that it needs. The underlying issue is that the Death Series servitors are enabling the Imperial Army to pursue objectives that were previously far beyond its reach. Integration is not a one-sided process, the army must also adapt to work with the undead. At face value, it seems a simple application of power, but the direction of said power and the management of everything that supports it is essential for its effective utilization. At this rate, we're going to go from being known as the Imperial Knights to the Imperial Rangers. Only if the Empire intends for its citizens to live in this sort of terrain. A smile touched Lady Zaradnik's lips. After a few days, it feels like the companies already can't wait to leave. Also, the fact that the Imperial Army has had generations to optimize itself for its role as the bulwark of the Empire should not be looked down upon. Your forces are well suited for maintaining the security of your lands. The Death Series servitors free the Empire from its reliance on adventurers and workers, allowing for more comprehensive control of national defense. The problems that come with fighting in territory unsuited for one's forces is not a problem unique to the Imperial Army. These undead are primarily meant to augment the security of the Empire and will operate without issues in your developed territories. The leased forces are prohibited from participating in wars of aggression against officially recognized populations and their territories, so operations like this one should be limited once your frontiers have been consolidated. Having already heard her feelings on the matter of the Empire's operations, Rangobart wondered how she was able to keep any sign of her stance on the matter from leaking out. Even as a noble, it must have required a supreme effort of will to suppress. The army occupied the hill as night fell and they threw themselves into preparing their encampment. After setting up his tent, Rangobart went over to join several of the other mages for a freshly cooked meal. With the relative ease that the 2nd Legion had pushing through the disorganized and isolated tribes, his only mana usage came from maintaining defensive enchantments. Not that he minded it. In the short time campaigning through the blister, Rangobart went from envying the regular soldiery for the experiences they shared in combat to being subjected to one such experience himself. He was now of the mind that those who came up with the imperial propaganda that glorified the army's combat roles and those who unironically reveled in war were either delusional or psychopathic. While he would still do what needed to be done, his regular policing and patrol duties felt infinitely more productive. Rangobart sat down at the fire with his bowl in hand, wondering what sort of ideas he might be able to bounce off of the mages who had gathered for dinner. Just as he settled on a topic to broach, fresh activity rose from the crest of the hill. Lady Zaradnik came down from the headquarters, skirting around the tents at a brisk jog. "What's going on, my lady?" Rangobart asked as the Baroness went by. "The Dragon Lord is active again," she didn't stop as she replied. "I need to go." Her pure white armor was swallowed by the darkness below. Commands started issuing from above. "Get off the hill and into cover. The big green bitch is in the air." Rangobart took one last look at his barely touched meal before tossing it aside. Coins and gems tumbled over one another as Ririk Sixthrius devoured a gnoll who had conveniently entered her lair. After days of rest and recovery, she woke up famished, and the terrified yelp of the hyena beastman as she snapped it up from the cavern floor made for a fine spice. One large chunk at a time, flesh, hide and bones all disappeared into her ravenous maw. She settled back onto her hoard, one of several hidden around the jungle, gingerly testing her injured wing. The cuts and scrapes she had sustained from the undead were a trivial matter, but the sight of her torn and discolored wing after the frost dragon attack unsettled her more than she cared to admit. While she healed, she brooded over the undead ambush and the appearance of the frost dragon that had wounded her so. Rerix could not puzzle out any reason why a frost dragon would ally with the undead, but whites were weak and notoriously stupid as far as dragons went. The undead had reportedly come from the west, so it was possible that a night lich or some other powerful undead being had subjugated the frost dragon population in the Azalisia Mountains. This was an unprecedented development, yet it seemed the one that made the most sense with what she now understood. A powerful undead being had slain the white dragon lord of the Azalisia Mountains, resulting in the disappearance of his domain. Then the remaining frost dragons were enslaved, perhaps their frost giant rivals, as well. After hearing of her magnificent wealth, thieves and assassins had then been sent to steal her treasure and slay her in the process. A low growl echoed from the walls of the cavern. The undead she had encountered were not a true threat, she could deal with them at her leisure. The frost dragon, however, was a matter of utmost concern. Most annoyingly, Rerix could not tell how strong she was from their brief encounter. By her size alone, she was an adult. But an adult frost dragon should have been far weaker than the undead that had stolen her tribute and participated in the failed ambush. The fact that she could do such grievous harm only meant one thing. A deviant. Rerix tail lashed against her horde, sending a wave of treasure to wash up against the nearby cavern wall. Deviants were mostly considered fools amongst dragonkind, pursuing limited paths that only lesser beings deigned to tread. Rarely, however, there were those who succeeded in harnessing true power far beyond what their age might suggest. In draconic culture, those who grew to become ancients, wielded exotic magics or achieved great strength through outstanding powers were recognized as lords. It was entirely possible that the laughably small frost dragon who had attacked her was in reality a dragon lord or at least an existence approaching one. Rerix mind worked to devise a solution for her most pressing problem. Generally speaking, white dragons were simpletons who presented no threat to green dragons. As if to counterbalance this deficiency, they were ludicrously stealthy, agile and possessed minds that worked with increasing efficiency the more familiar their situation and environment became. This made them the greatest hunters amongst dragonkind, but they were limited by their relative weakness, limited intellect and poor spellcasting ability. But what if one was a deviant who had stumbled upon great power? Exceeding their natural limits, the perfect hunter could become the perfect assassin, one who had been sent after her. The longer this frost dragon was allowed to loiter about, the more effective she would become. Dispatching her was Rerix number one priority. She would kill the frost dragon and then destroy the remaining undead. After putting away her tribute, she would learn what she could about the unseen mastermind who had orchestrated the raid on her domain. Eventually, she would enact her vengeance upon them. A gale whirled down the cavern as Rerix beat her wings. The injured one hadn't fully recovered, but it was enough to get around. She made her way out the long tunnel to the lair's entrance and poked her head out from behind the waterfall concealing it. Several minutes passed as she examined her surroundings. The troglodytes dwelling along the escarpment appeared undisturbed by any intrusion. As far as she could see, no one was flying overhead. When nothing appeared to attack her, she made her way out, annoyed over the notion that her caution might be seen as cowering. Rerix strode between the colossal trees, staying sharp for any sign of movement below or above. Before she had eaten her, the gnoll said something about the jungle being invaded. The Empire, if it was to be believed. That they were reportedly working with the undead made the claim even less credible than it already was. Something like an undead being becoming the new overlord of the human nation would have some rather obvious effects, none of which had been noted. They might have been hired mercenaries of some sort, in an effort to sow confusion. Maybe they thought Rerix could be made a fool out of by tricking her into attacking her tributaries. The idea had a certain tasteful intelligence to it. Great acts of treachery and deceit were to be admired and boasted about, after all. She would not be deceived by such a shallow ploy, however. With a single flyover, she would recognize the invaders for what they were. The odor of char drew her to the remains of a small gnoll camp. Jungle scavengers had dragged most of the corpses away and nothing of value had been left behind. Mixed in with the sense of the ransacked camp was the faint trace of steel, humans and hippogriffs. She looked at the boughs overhead, peering through the gaps in the canopy. Was it possible that the Empire had indeed invaded the jungle? What were the chances that the mercenaries brought in to pose as Imperial Knights also happened to have hippogriffs? No, it was probable that they were trying to lead her along that line of thinking. The premeditated nature of the raid on the treasure convoy meant that they had plenty of time to prepare the right actors. After coming across 4 more destroyed Gnoll camps, Rerix 63's impatience grew. Not only were Gnoll camps being raided, but those of every other demi-human race in the jungle, as well. It appeared that the isolated tribes were being picked off. She would have to visit the larger tribes to collect information and demand healing. Finding a suitably wide gap in the canopy, she launched herself into the air. A rush of cool winter wind swirled around her as she skimmed over the treetops. On her way to the lake near her main lair, she noticed a multitude of smoke trails rising out of the trees a dozen kilometers to her south. Should I investigate right away or? What was she thinking? After a single minor skirmish, was the Viridian Dragon Lord afraid of soaring in her own domain? Rerix 63's banked southwards. Over the hill from where the smoke arose, she discovered thousands of abandoned tents and fires. Making a wide circle over the area, a guttural growl rose from her throat. Shouts and screams drifted up from below. Thousands of humans scattered from their hiding places as she winged over them. Her mirth over their reaction was cut short when she confirmed what they were. Unless the invaders had somehow secured or fabricated thousands of sets of equipment to maintain their guise, the teeming humans below were indeed Imperial Knights. Cold fury rose within Rerix 63's. The Empire had betrayed her? After she had so graciously allowed them to exist in her domain? This wouldn't do. An example would need to be made. She ascended, leaving the Imperial army behind. They would probably take days to make it out of the jungle. In that time, she would pillage their cities and raze them to the ground. These prideful invaders would return to the ruins of their empire. After that, the humans would never consider turning on her again. Ludmilla found Elishnish awaiting her at the base of the hill. The frost dragon cast a glowing turquoise eye in her direction as she approached. Her companion's anxiety could be felt clearly through their bond, lending to her a detached sense of draconic worry. A part of Ludmilla wanted to reassure her, but, at the same time, she could offer no guarantees of success or safety. Did she come from where you said she was lairing? A few kilometers from there. Considering the most recent thing that happened to her, it must have felt much safer to walk. Then why did she suddenly decide to fly? I have no idea. Perhaps she will be so kind as to answer you if you ask. Elishnish's sarcastic response brought a smile to Ludmilla's lips. She was scared, but there was still plenty of fight in her. Oh, by the way. Ludmilla reached into an infinite haversack. Elishnish's tail twitched. Is that a saddle? At some point, I realized the tack on the Soul Eater that Lord Cocytus lent me was a magic item. I went over to the fortress to pick it up after our fight with that Dragon Lord. She had never seen the Frost Dragon give her a dirty look before, but there was a first time for everything. It should help you maneuver, shouldn't it? You've been restricting your movements when we're together. I don't want you to get hurt because we haven't been using the proper equipment. Elishnish thoroughly scowled at the saddle before letting out a frosty sigh. It didn't sit well on her at all, at least until the magic item adjusted itself. Are you experiencing any discomfort? My father would have some very choice words for me if he had lived to see this. Ludmilla vaulted onto the saddle, placing her feet in the stirrups. At least for her, it was immeasurably easier to stay securely seated. Elishnish shifted her shoulders experimentally before walking over to scale a nearby tree. Ludmilla leaned forward to balance herself. The legends never portrayed dragons climbing trees. Though there is no notable mention of them in your legends, I think humans underestimate how huge trees can be. I must have found 24 green dragons perched in the branches around the jungle. Where have you been keeping all these dead dragons? I haven't. Norford is just over the mountain, so I just drop them off at Zushiru's stand when my bags get full. What does he do with them? After having the local industries process them into materials, he holds on to everything but the fleshy bits since we can't keep them fresh. He said something about it being better to bring the rest back to the Sorceress Kingdom. She didn't know whether Zushiru's claim was true or not, but Elishnish appeared to fully trust the Quagua on matters of trade. Considering what went into earning a Frost Dragon's trust, she couldn't imagine what had gone on between them. Perhaps it was because the Quagga had long been tributaries of the Frost Dragons and their races were accustomed to one another. They entered the canopy layer, where Elishnish continued making her way up until she could cautiously poke her head out from between the highest branches. "Oh, she's already here. Conceal yourself so we can sneak into the air unnoticed. Can we intercept her before she attacks the Imperial army?" "I'm not certain. Losses are unavoidable unless we preemptively attack her, which would cause us to lose our current advantage. If she attacks the army, immediate obliteration is unlikely. She'd probably kill a few hundred before stopping to gloat over the rest until she's satisfied." "Is that a green dragon thing?" "It's more of a general dragon thing. Dealing with every little mortal that crosses us would be absurd. Establishing dominance through a few highly visible acts is more efficient. I'm sure you've already come to realize this, but most races around here fall in line with little fuss once insurmountable gaps in power are made clear. Humans are for some reason slow to wake up when reality comes calling, so more elaborate displays are required to get one's point across." Elishnish rose on silent wings as they ascended to a position a few hundred meters above the Viridian Dragon Lord. Cries of panic rose from the jungle floor as the Imperial army shattered under the effects of dragon fear. Ludmilla watched worriedly as Elishnish maneuvered to line herself up for an attack against the ancient green dragon, expecting the imminent death of thousands of Imperial knights. They followed her through another turn and, just as Elishnish settled overhead, the Dragon Lord ascended and veered to the southwest. Was she supposed to do that? And no. She didn't even make any dramatic declarations. Elishnish picked up her pace as their target sped along with no sign of altering her course. She maintained her distance as Ludmilla tried to figure out what was going on. Why didn't she attack the Imperial army? Is she trying to destroy the supplies we left at the previous camps? It's possible. Green dragons prefer employing manipulation and coercion to make things go their way, and they generally enjoy the sense of superiority gained when they feel that they're in control. Terror, anxiety and desperation are flavors that they prefer. I can only wonder how frost dragons differ. You should already have some idea of it. We prefer to ambush our prey. This also goes for our adversaries. For lack of a better description, we pounce. On the ground, at any rate. I guess it's swooping when we're in the air, and we'll also pop up under or near our targets when attacking from below. Reactions of shock and sudden terror are things that we naturally have an appreciation for, a confirmation of success if you will. But that at least makes sense. Green dragon behavior is a mystery to me. This is because we are similar, yes? We're both hunters, and so we see many things the same way. If there's a human who malevolently plots and schemes an unhealthy amount, I'm sure they'll appreciate many of the same things that green dragons do. Their stealthy pursuit continued, and the Viridian Dragon Lord did not stop to destroy the Imperial army depots left behind for their 2-day sweep. Nor did she change her course. As time passed and they crossed the mountains rising along the southern edge of the jungle, Ludmilla realized that her worst fears were coming to pass. The Viridian Dragon Lord was attacking the Empire.